The Kamikaze, possibly the most feared and daring attack weapon in all of World War II. These attacks would be devastating to American ships, but in their shadow, they would also create the story of an American hero. In this video, we will look at a Corsair pilot who would rise to the occasion in 1945, taking down 5 of the suicidal Japanese planes in a single day and saving the lives of thousands of Americans. In the greatest battles of World War II, nations went to great lengths to protect their sensitive information. Today, in the digital world, militaries are doing it even more, and you should be too, with one of my favorite products and the sponsor of this video, Yubico. Yubico is a cutting-edge way to protect your important and sensitive information that is far safer than just using passwords alone. They offer an advanced 2-factor authentication system with their physical keys that protect you from hackers, phishing attacks, and everything else that you might need to defend against. And before you ask, it is super compatible. It works seamlessly with Google, Facebook, YouTube, Dropbox, and a ton of other apps. The YubiKey works with pretty much any device and all of your favorite operating systems. In addition, it is crush and water resistant just in case you happen to have it on you when you're shot down behind enemy lines. So don't let the enemy get a hold of your personal or sensitive information. Instead, check out Yubico today and their fantastic products for individual protection, business security, and everything in between. Thanks again to Yubico, and without further ado, enjoy. As the Second World War in Europe began to slow with the advancing Soviet and Allied troops pushing towards Berlin in the spring of 1945, the conflict in the Pacific continued to rage with incredible zeal. Imperial Japan intensely battled the Allied forces on the sea and on the Pacific Islands, with the Americans advancing ever closer towards mainland Japan. But for the passionate followers of the Emperor, not an inch of ground would be given, it could only be taken. To effectively take on the Japanese this close to their home, the United States brought in a new and formidable aircraft to lead the assault, the F4U Corsair. The Corsair became known as the Whistling Death, a terrifying name to be associated with the U.S. naval aviators who would utilize its massive engine to carry out ground support missions and dogfights over the Pacific. The design for the F4U Corsair was first developed in early 1938 by Rex Beasel, the chief engineer at the Vought Aircraft Company. It had a unique inverted gull wing style and a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that provided a great deal of power and speed. Thus, the Corsair would become one of the fastest and most powerful planes in the entire war. The plane did suffer some early setbacks, but eventually it was picked up in early 1943 when the U.S. Marines were given access to F4Us for use across the Pacific theater. This created the famous squadron, the Jolly Rogers, who shot down 152 Japanese aircraft, as well as the Marine Fighting Squadron VMF-214, better known as the Black Sheep, who were commanded by Medal of Honor recipient Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. But despite these famous groups, perhaps its most memorable and influential moment of the war might have actually come in a perilous dogfight on the seas in 1945 as part of the infamous Battle of Okinawa. After the American victory on Iwo Jima, the American forces were made clearly aware of the mindset of the Imperial forces, that Japan would fight on till the death. And so the Americans chose their next target to help prepare for an invasion of Japan, a small island called Okinawa. This would be known as Operation Iceberg. Through mid-1944, the Allies had begun heavy shelling of Japanese-occupied territories and islands, stretching across the Pacific and, as Allied victories were won, further towards mainland Japan. And so, fairly soon, in April of 1945, American Marines began landing on the beaches of Okinawa. But as American forces awaited in the ocean and provided support for the invasion, a new threat began to emerge and became a feared tactic in the Pacific: the Kamikaze. Kamikazes, or Divine Wind, so named after the infamous 1281 typhoon that swept away the Mongol naval fleet and prevented the invasion from landing on Japanese soil, were purposeful and suicidal crashes that were sought to strike valuable enemy targets, primarily aircraft carriers and other large ships. In the Second World War, as the Japanese began to lose the battle in the air and on the ocean, they needed to take more drastic measures to try and defend their homeland, and thus the idea for the kamikaze came about. Over the course of the war, kamikazes were responsible for several thousand Allied casualties, and over 3,000 Japanese pilots were killed during these attacks. In these suicidal missions, Japanese pilots sank 34 Allied ships, and hundreds of others were severely damaged throughout the war. At the Battle of Okinawa alone, it is estimated that the number of US sailors and Marines that were killed from kamikaze attacks is well into the thousands. And because of the gung-ho nature of these attacks, often these kamikazes were difficult for anti-aircraft and pilots to defend against. But despite all these difficulties, there was one man who clearly showed that he had no problem taking down Japanese kamikazes, and perhaps the hero of the most famous anti-kamikaze mission in World War II. This would be Jeremiah O'Keefe. O'Keefe was a Corsair pilot serving with the renowned VMF 323 Marine Squadron, better known as the Death Rattlers. While at college, the native Mississippian enlisted in the Navy like many of the others after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and found himself assigned to the squadron a few years later. In April of 1945, O'Keefe, now a first lieutenant, and the rest of the Death Rattlers were headed out towards Okinawa from the USS White Plains, assigned to provide cover for the invading ground forces and bombarding Japanese airfields and fortifications when possible. It would be here on this day that his name would be cemented into history. As the VMF 323 squadron flew over Okinawa on the 22nd of April, 24 Corsairs in total roared through the sky. Here they would spot a large flight in the distance, and based on their fixed landing gear and the direction from which they were coming, it could only be the Japanese. The sky quickly filled with more than 80 Val dive bombers, a clear indicator that this was yet another kamikaze attack, headed right towards the American ships stationed by the island. Despite being vastly outnumbered, however, O'Keefe and the Death Rattlers leapt into action, flying out to break up the formation of Imperial aircraft. The young O'Keefe chose a target and dove in. With the Corsair being an aircraft much faster than his opponent, the obvious attack method was what would become known as boom and zoom, meaning that the attacker would dive into his opponent, open fire, hitting them, and then use superior speed and momentum to pull away from the dogfight, leaving the enemy far behind. This would be the exact strategy that O'Keefe would use to open up this engagement. Diving in his Corsair right at the Val in his crosshairs, he opened up and drilled the poorly armored Japanese plane. His 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns destroyed it immediately, sending it downward in a ball of flames. Splash 1 kamikaze for the young American. Immediately after pulling up from this attack, however, he spotted another group of kamikazes and turned to take them on as well. He opened up, but this time misses with his initial burst of fire. This causes the Val to pull away from the rest of the group and dive down towards the ocean. O'Keefe chooses to follow him, trying not to pass the slower aircraft in the intense dive. Eventually, the Val arrives at the ocean and has nowhere else to run. O'Keefe opened up and tallies his second kill of the day as the Japanese pilot meets the ocean like the first. But then, just a few seconds later, another Val appears, passing by him in a blink. But this one seems far more aggressive than the first two that he has faced. This Val actually appears to be attacking the Corsair instead of running from it. O'Keefe turns with the Val and quickly finds himself in a deadly scissors dogfight right above the surface of the ocean. This may be a kamikaze, but clearly has the mind of a dogfighter. This particular engagement is fairly dangerous for the American, as the Val is much slower and can likely turn at a sharper angle, which makes it difficult to fight against at low altitude. But fortunately, the American comes out on top, and O'Keefe gets a shot at the Japanese plane. He hits it hard, but it does not go down immediately. The Val, in a last-ditch effort to try and make a difference, tries to ram O'Keefe's Corsair and narrowly misses, just before crashing into the ocean. Now Splash 2 and Splash 3 for Jeremiah O'Keefe. With 3 kills on the day now, the Corsair pilot opts to use his speed advantage and gain some altitude. There are still planes covering the sky, and he will need to climb back up to the dogfight to do his job. As he gets back up to the action, he spots another Val. This one, however, appears to be oblivious to O'Keefe on his 6 o'clock and barely moves as he lines him up in front of him. He opens up and it goes down immediately for an easy kill. Splash 4 Japanese planes. Then finally, O'Keefe spots one last Japanese aircraft, but this one appears to already be in his attack run, headed right for the American ships. It is clear that he must stop it, but there is a new limiting factor quickly coming into play: his ammunition. The Corsair's 50 caliber machine guns are certainly low on ammo by this point, and he knows that he cannot have many rounds left, but nonetheless he goes after the final Kamikaze. As the final Japanese plane in his sight levels off for the attack run, O'Keefe comes up behind and puts the Val right in front of him. Fortunately for O'Keefe, most of the Kamikaze bombers lack tail gunners, as they only need one pilot to crash into a ship. So, at as close of range as he can possibly get to make sure that any remaining rounds find their target, he pulls the trigger and watches tracers fly. The Val sustains heavy damage and catches fire quickly, going down towards the sea, well clear of the American ships. Now O'Keefe, realizing the feat of what he has just accomplished, turns for his carrier and leaves the engagement. Upon linking up with his group and safely landing back on the carrier, they find out that the Death Rattlers have had a historic day, taking down a total of 17 Japanese Val dive bombers loaded to the brim with explosives. In the engagement, they would not lose a single Corsair, and not one Japanese Kamikaze would make it to the American fleet. In addition, O'Keefe found his fighter to be completely out of ammunition when he landed on the carrier, fully exhausting his machine guns. The contributions of the Death Rattlers on this day no doubt saved the lives of hundreds or even thousands of American men, led by the incredible actions of Jeremiah O'Keefe. The famous airman would survive the war, finishing with 7 kills, and would pass away in 2016 at the age of 93. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider subscribing.